11 years ago, the New Mexico sun felt like a promise. For Liam, Maya, and Ben, it was the dawn of everything. Standing on the precipice of college graduation, their futures were as vast and bright as the desert sky. Liam, the group's anchor, exuded a quiet confidence that made the most dangerous trails feel safe. Maya, with her ever-present video camera, was the trio's chronicler, her artist's eye capturing the fleeting moments of their youth in grainy, heartfelt footage. And then there was Ben, the catalyst, whose infectious energy and thirst for the next thrill constantly pushed them toward the edge of the map. They were inseparable, a perfect triangle of cautious observation, steady leadership, and impulsive adventure, utterly unaware that this spring day would be their last together. Their shared life was a collage of dusty road trips in Liam's beaten-up Ford, nights spent under star-dusted skies, and weekends dedicated to conquering the untamed wilderness that surrounded their small college town. The rugged landscape was their playground, a place of profound beauty and silent, unforgiving power. This particular trip was meant to be a final celebration, one last adventure before their lives diverged onto separate paths. The plan was simple: explore the well-documented main chambers of the Oak Haven Caverns, a familiar challenge they had tackled before. Their gear was laid out with practiced ease: coils of rope, headlamps with fresh batteries, and backpacks stuffed with water and granola bars, a routine so normal it felt mundane, masking the catastrophic deviation that was to come. It was Ben who first voiced the temptation, his words slicing through the comfortable familiarity of their preparations. He spoke of a legend, a whispered rumor among local explorers about an uncharted passage, the Veiled Maw, strictly off-limits, but said to lead to a chamber of breathtaking crystalline formations. Maya's camera lens zoomed in on the weathered "Danger Unstable Area" sign, her hesitation palpable even in silence. Liam, ever the pragmatist, weighed the risks, but the allure of one last truly epic discovery proved too strong. A shared look of defiant excitement passed between them, a silent pact sealed by youthful invincibility. They were not just exploring a cave, they were stepping into their own legend, unaware that the darkness ahead would swallow them whole, leaving only echoes behind. The air inside the Veiled Maw was instantly different, heavy, ancient, and cold enough to raise goosebumps on their arms. It smelled of wet stone and deep, undisturbed earth. The beams from their headlamps sliced through an absolute blackness that felt solid, a physical presence that swallowed sound and light with equal hunger. Ben, leading the way, let out a whoop of excitement, the sound echoing strangely, becoming thin and distant in an instant. Maya followed, her camera's red recording light a tiny, brave star in the oppressive dark. She filmed the rough-hewn walls, slick with moisture that glittered like a skin of black diamonds. Liam brought up the rear, his movements deliberate as he tested each foothold, his ears tuned to the groans of the rock, the quiet language of the deep earth. The passage began to narrow, forcing them to turn sideways, their backpacks scraping against the coarse, unyielding rock. The sound was like a harsh whisper, a constant reminder of how tightly the cave held them. A small shower of pebbles and dust rained down from above, and Maya flinched, her camera jolting to capture the ceiling. Ben laughed it off, his voice slightly strained. "The mountain's just saying hello," he called back, his bravado a thin shield against the growing tension. Liam, however, paused, his light tracing the network of fractures above them. He felt a prickle of unease, a deep-seated instinct telling him that the cave was not welcoming them, it was tolerating them, and its patience was finite. After what felt like an hour of claustrophobic maneuvering, the tunnel opened dramatically into a cavern of breathtaking beauty. It was a geode cathedral, its walls, floor, and ceiling coated in crystalline formations that soared like frozen spires. Their headlamps ignited the chamber, fracturing the light into a million shimmering rainbows. "Whoa," Ben breathed, his earlier bravado melting into genuine awe. Maya's lens panned slowly, trying to absorb the impossible spectacle, the silent, glittering world that had been hidden from human eyes. For a moment, the fear, the tight passage, and the warning sign were forgotten. They had found their legend, a secret pocket of impossible beauty, and in that shared moment of discovery, they felt infinite and invincible. The decision to turn back was made reluctantly, the magic of the crystal chamber fading as the practical need for safety reasserted itself. Liam took the lead, his memory of the twists and turns their only map. But the passage that should have been familiar now seemed alien, a fork he didn't remember seeing, a drop-off that felt steeper. The oppressive darkness, once a thrilling challenge, now felt menacing, actively working to confuse them. "This is it, right?" Ben asked, his voice lacking its usual certainty. The echoes of his question seemed to mock them, bouncing off identical-looking walls. The silence that followed was heavier than any rock, filled with the dawning, terrifying realization that their path back had vanished. The true terror began not with a sound, but with a low, gut-wrenching vibration that hummed through the soles of their boots. It grew into a deep, guttural roar as the ceiling above the passage ahead of them gave way. An avalanche of rock and earth cascaded down, a deafening explosion of sound that ripped through the silence. Dust billowed out, instantly choking them, reducing their headlamp beams to hazy, useless glows. When the last boulder settled with a sickening thud, a profound and terrifying silence fell. The way forward, the way they believed was out, was gone, replaced by a solid, impenetrable wall of fresh fallen rock. Ben screamed in frustration and rage, while Maya's camera captured Liam's face, pale and grim, illuminated in the swirling dust. Trapped. The word was a physical weight, pressing down on them from tons of unmoving stone. Their headlamp beams swept frantically across the rockfall, revealing no gaps, no hope of a path through. The air was thick with the taste of dust and the metallic tang of fear. Ben hammered a fist against the new wall, the dull thud a pathetic sound against the immense power of the earth. Liam was already checking their supplies, his movements sharp and jerky, his mind racing to fight off the despair that threatened to drown them. Maya's camera remained on, the small red light an unblinking witness. It captured their ragged breathing, their whispered, frantic plans, and the vast, suffocating darkness that had become their prison. 11 years is an eternity built from ordinary days. The initial storm of search teams, flashing news cameras, and desperate shouted commands eventually subsided, leaving behind a silence more profound than any noise. The Oakhaven Caverns incident slowly bled from headlines into local lore, a ghost story whispered to teenagers as a warning against recklessness. For the world outside, the mystery of the 3 lost students became a closed file, a fated tragedy. But for those left behind, time didn't heal. It hollowed. The gaping wound of their absence never scabbed over. Instead, it became a part of the landscape of their lives, a desolate canyon into which every hope, every memory, and every passing year seemed to fall without a sound. For David, Liam's father, the silence was a constant accusation. His home transformed into a cold case headquarters, a shrine to a search that never officially ended. The dining room table was permanently buried under topographical maps of the region, each contour and crevice highlighted with colored pins that marked every failed search grid. Photographs of Liam, Maya, and Ben, vibrant with the life that had been stolen from them, stared back at him from a corkboard crowded with newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. Every morning he would sit with a cold cup of coffee, tracing the same lines on the map, rereading the same witness statements, his grief having calcified into a relentless, methodical obsession. He wasn't just waiting for answers, he was hunting them. Maya's parents chose a different path, one paved with public remembrance rather than private investigation. They channeled their bottomless sorrow into the Maya Flores Memorial Art Scholarship, ensuring their daughter's passion for capturing the world's beauty would live on in others. Each spring, on the anniversary of the disappearance, they held a quiet vigil near the sealed-off cave entrance, releasing 3 paper lanterns into the twilight sky. Their pain was a quiet, dignified performance of memory, an act of defiance against the void. They accepted that their daughter was gone, but they refused to let her be forgotten, turning their grief into a beacon of light for other young artists, a legacy built from the ashes of their heartbreak. In stark contrast, Ben's parents retreated entirely, pulling the world in around them like a shroud. Their house, once a place of boisterous energy mirroring their son's, became a fortress of bitterness. The curtains were always drawn, the lawn grew wild, and they spoke to no one. Their grief had soured into a potent, corrosive anger at the authorities for giving up, at Liam for not being a better leader, at Maya for documenting the recklessness, and, most tragically, at Ben himself for his insatiable thirst for the edge. They were entombed in their loss, rejecting any form of solace or community, their silence a testament to a pain so deep it had become poison, isolating them from the very world their son had so eagerly embraced. David often found himself lost in memory, the past a more tangible place than the empty present. He'd stare at a photo of Liam taken just days before the trip, his son's confident smile, a cruel mockery of what was to come. He remembered the feel of the rough canvas of Liam's backpack as he'd helped him pack it, the easy promise of "See you Sunday, Dad." The words echoed in his mind, a perpetual loop of guilt. Had he said enough? Had he warned him strongly enough? This internal dialogue was a form of self-flagellation, each remembered detail a fresh lash. The search wasn't just for Liam's body. It was a desperate quest for absolution, for a way to forgive himself. The 11-year vigil had carved itself onto David's face, etching deep lines of exhaustion and sorrow around his eyes. He looked like a man haunted not by a ghost, but by the sheer, crushing weight of absence. Periodically, he would drive out to the trailhead, the gravel crunching under his tires like breaking bones. The official Danger Unstable Area sign was now rusted and pocked with bullet holes, a forgotten relic. He would stand there for hours, staring at the impassive face of the mountain, its silence feeling like a personal taunt. The vast, beautiful landscape that his son had loved had become his enemy, a silent, unmoving accomplice that held its secrets with an unforgiving grip, refusing to yield its dead. Retired Detective Miller lived with the same silence, though his was one of professional failure. The Oakhaven Caverns case was the one smudge on an otherwise decorated career, the file he kept in a box in his garage, unable to relegate it to the archives. He'd sometimes see David in town, a walking ghost of the case, and the old familiar shame would churn in his gut. They had done everything by the book, exhausted every resource, but the cave had beaten them. Miller knew with a certainty that kept him awake on quiet nights that the earth didn't just swallow 3 kids. Something was missed, a detail, a clue, a whisper. The mystery became his white whale, a creature of darkness lurking just beneath the surface of his peaceful retirement. And so the years passed. The official investigation gathered dust in a records room, a footnote in the county's history of tragic accidents. The story of the lost cavers became a cautionary tale, its sharp edges worn smooth by time and retelling. The world moved on, as it always does, building new lives over the foundations of old sorrows. But for a father who refused to give up, for families fractured by grief, and for a detective haunted by his one defeat, the story was not over. The silence was not an ending. It was a long, sustained breath held in anticipation of a scream, a decade-long pause before a truth, buried and forgotten, was about to be violently unearthed. The discovery came not with a shout from a search party, but with the mundane thud of a sledgehammer against drywall. Miles from the Oak Haven Caverns, a derelict ranger outpost, long surrendered to dust and decay, was finally being gutted. For the construction crew, it was just another job, the air thick with the smell of plaster dust and mildewed wood. A worker named Carlos, sweat beading on his forehead, swung the hammer into a hollow-sounding section of an interior wall. Instead of the expected explosion of lath and plaster, there was a dull crack and a strange give. Peering into the newly made hole, his flashlight beam cut through the darkness and landed on something that didn't belong. A dark, rubberized bag wedged tightly between the studs. A hush fell over the small crew as Carlos carefully pulled the object from its dusty tomb. It was a waterproof dry bag, the kind a caver or kayaker would use, its surface caked with dried mud and grime that spoke of a long, dark history. It felt heavy, substantial, a time capsule sealed against the years. The sheer incongruity of the find was staggering. This wasn't an old tool or a dead animal, but a deliberately placed, deliberately hidden package. The men gathered around, their voices low, a shared sense of trespassing on a forgotten secret hanging in the air. This was something for the authorities. The demolition work stopped, the silence of the abandoned outpost suddenly feeling heavier, charged with the weight of a story that had refused to stay buried. The call reached retired Detective Miller on his back porch as he was tending to his tomato plants. The name Oak Haven, spoken by the sheriff on the other end of the line, was like an electric shock, jolting him from the placid rhythm of his retirement. He listened, his knuckles white on the railing, the familiar churn of failure and frustration rising in his gut. A bag inside a wall. The absurdity of it warred with the sudden sharp surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. He dropped his trowel, the dirt clinging to his hands, forgotten. This was it. The loose thread he always knew was there. The drive to the old outpost was a blur, his mind racing through old case files, piecing together a puzzle that had just been given a new, impossible corner piece. David received Miller's call while sitting at his dining room table, surrounded by the same maps that had been his companions for over a decade. He listened without speaking, his body rigid, the phone pressed hard against his ear. The words didn't make sense at first. Not the cave, a wall, a building. Hope, an emotion he had learned to treat as a poison, began to seep into his veins, terrifying and potent. He felt a tremor in his hands as he hung up, the silence of his house roaring in his ears. For 11 years, he had imagined every possible scenario of discovery within the mountain's embrace, but never this. This was different. This was not an accident. This suggested intent, a human hand hiding a secret, and it changed the entire landscape of his grief. At the outpost, the air was thick with a tension that felt sacred and profane. David stood beside Miller, his eyes locked on the mud-stained bag now lying on a sterile evidence table. It looked like a relic from another civilization, an artifact unearthed from a tomb. A forensics technician, with methodical slowness, sliced open the sealed top. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. David held his breath, his heart pounding, a painful rhythm against his ribs. This was the moment. 11 years of silence, of unanswered prayers and agonizing questions were contained within that bag. He braced himself for the crushing weight of whatever truth was about to be revealed, a truth he had both hunted and dreaded for a third of his life. One by one, the contents were carefully extracted and laid out, each object a ghost. First, Maya's video camera, its lens spiderwebbed with cracks, but its body eerily intact. Then, a small leather-bound journal, its pages warped and stained by moisture, yet still holding the ink of final thoughts. Finally, a single, muddy climbing glove, stiff with age. The room was silent, save for the click of a photographer's camera. These were not the skeletal remains David had steeled himself to find one day. This was evidence. The discovery didn't bring closure. It ripped the case wide open, transforming a tragedy of nature into a chilling mystery of human action. The question was no longer just what happened to them, but who had sealed their story behind a wall. The forensics lab was a world away from the dusty ranger outpost, a sterile, silent environment where the past was dissected under fluorescent lights. David and Miller stood like statues behind a glass partition, watching a technician in a white coat handle Maya's camera with the delicacy of a bomb disposal expert. Every piece of equipment, from the humidity-controlled chamber housing the journal to the complex rig designed to extract data from the damaged memory card, felt like an instrument of either salvation or damnation. For David, the silence was agonizing, a vacuum filled with 11 years of unanswered questions. He felt a profound internal schism, a desperate hunger for the truth clashing violently with the paralyzing fear of what that truth might be. This was the precipice he had sought for so long, and he was terrified of the fall. The first fragile voice from the past came not from the camera, but from the journal. After days of meticulous work, a technician managed to stabilize and digitally scan the final water-damaged pages. Miller slid the printouts across a steel table towards David, his face grim. Maya's neat script, which started with descriptions of the geode cathedral, grew increasingly erratic. The words painted a vivid picture of their dawning horror. The wrong turn, the growing confusion, the gut-wrenching rumble of the rockfall. David read the words, and the sterile lab dissolved around him. He was in the dark with them, feeling the cold, the suffocating dust, and the icy grip of his son's despair. It was no longer a story, it was a memory he was experiencing for the first time. News of the discovery stirred the ashes of old griefs, and not all of them settled peacefully. Ben's parents, hollowed out by years of bitter isolation, reacted with a corrosive anger. Reached by Detective Miller for a statement, they refused, their voices laced with venom over the phone. They accused David of orchestrating a media circus, of trying to rewrite history to absolve Liam of his leadership role in the tragedy. To them, this new evidence was a cruel illusion, a desperate attempt to shift blame from their son's recklessness and Liam's failure to prevent it. Their resistance was a brutal emotional obstacle, a reminder to David that even a shared tragedy could splinter and decay into uniquely personal and deeply irreconcilable versions of pain. The investigation pivoted on a single terrifying journal entry near the end. Scrawled with a shaky hand, almost illegible, were 4 words that changed everything. "We are not alone." David read the line 3 times, his mind refusing to process the implication. Miller leaned over his shoulder, his breath catching in his throat. An accident was a tragedy. This suggested something else entirely. The entire narrative of 3 kids lost to the unforgiving power of nature collapsed in an instant. The vast, empty darkness of the cave was suddenly populated by a 4th unknown presence. The mystery was no longer about geology and bad luck. It had become about a ghost, a hidden variable that transformed their desperate struggle for survival into something far more sinister. All focus now converged on the cracked video camera, the team's last and best hope for a witness. The data recovery process was a form of digital archaeology, sifting through layers of corruption for a single, coherent image. The technicians worked in shifts, their faces illuminated by the green glow of code scrolling across monitors. For David, the waiting was a unique form of hell. He sat in the visitors' lounge for days, the coffee growing cold in his hands, his gaze fixed on the lab door. He watched the technicians' shadows move behind the frosted glass, imagining the ghosts they were trying to resurrect. Miller saw the toll it was taking, the hope warring with exhaustion on David's face, and knew that whatever was on that camera would either grant him a final, painful peace or shatter him completely. The first recovered files were a bitter-sweet torment. They showed the beginning of the end, filled with the vibrant, oblivious energy of youth. There was Ben, mugging for the camera at the trailhead, his grin wide and infectious. There was Liam pointing out a feature on a map, his quiet confidence a comforting presence. Maya's artistic eye captured the play of sunlight on the canyon walls and the nervous excitement as they slipped into the veiled maw. For David, watching these clips was like pressing a fresh bruise. He saw his son, so full of life, a living, breathing person on the cusp of everything, and the 11 years of grief felt as raw and immediate as the day he first heard his son was missing. Then came the final breakthrough. The head technician called them in, his expression unreadable. "We salvaged one last clip," he said, his voice low. 30 seconds. The file was buried deep, heavily corrupted. On the large screen, the image flickered to life. It was chaos. The view was shaky, thrown around by panicked movement in near total darkness. The only sound, the ragged, desperate gasps of Maya's breathing. The headlamp beam bounced wildly, illuminating a sweating, terrified Ben, then a slick wall of rock. In the final 2 seconds, the camera steadied as if in a moment of horrified stillness. It focused on a figure standing just beyond their small circle of light. A gaunt, unfamiliar man, his face half in shadow, his eyes reflecting the beam with a chilling emptiness before the screen went black. A profound, deathly silence descended upon the room, broken only by David's sharp, ragged intake of breath. The image of the stranger's face was burned into his mind, a specter of pure malice emerging from the dark. This was not a rescuer. This was not another lost explorer. This was the answer. Miller swore under his breath, the professional veneer crumbling to reveal a cold, simmering rage. The accident was a lie. The tragedy was a facade. The final frantic entry in Maya's journal echoed in David's skull with terrifying clarity. He said he knew a way out. He was lying. The long, agonizing search for what had happened to his son was finally over. A new, more terrifying hunt for who had done it had just begun. The silence in the lab was a physical entity, a crushing weight that followed the video's abrupt end. David stared at the black screen, the after-image of the stranger's hollow eyes burned onto his retinas. The face was a specter, a phantom conjured from the depths of a nightmare he had lived for 11 years. Beside him, Miller let out a slow, ragged breath, the sound of a professional's composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. He pointed a trembling finger at the printout of Maya's journal. "He was lying," Miller whispered, the words hanging in the sterile air like a death sentence. The rockfall wasn't an accident. It was a tomb, deliberately sealed. The friends weren't just lost. They were led into a trap by the very man whose face now haunted the dark screen. A wave of something akin to relief, but colder and sharper, washed over David. The agonizing void of the unknown was finally filled, but with a truth more monstrous than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. The catharsis was not one of peace, but of pure, unadulterated rage. His grief, a formless, weary ache for 11 years, now had a face, a target. It had purpose. Miller, galvanized by the revelation, was already on the phone, his voice stripped of its retired weariness and replaced with the hard-edged authority of a hunter. The investigation was no longer a cold case about a tragic accident. It was an active manhunt. The blurry, low-resolution image of the killer was their only lead, a ghost they now had to drag into the light. Leaving the forensics lab, David felt the world shift on its axis. The mountain was no longer his enemy. It was just a place, a silent witness to a crime. The real monster had walked out of that cave, breathed the open air, and hidden the evidence of his sin behind a plaster wall. David drove home in a daze, the familiar weight of sorrow in his chest replaced by a heavy, cold stone of resolve. He stopped in front of the corkboard, his eyes finding Liam's smiling face. The boy in the photo was no longer just his lost son. He was a victim awaiting justice. The 11-year search for what happened was over. A new, more brutal hunt for who was just beginning, and David knew it would consume whatever was left of his life. The grainy image of the stranger, identified through old ranger logs as a transient drifter named Elias Thorne, who had vanished shortly after the incident, became the new ghost haunting the town. The manhunt, fueled by a decade of pent-up rage and grief, stretched across states but ultimately grew cold, Thorne having dissolved back into the anonymous shadows from which he came. For David, the truth was a cruel paradox. His dining room table was finally cleared of topographical maps, but in their place lay a single, faded, wanted poster. He knew what happened to Liam. He knew who was responsible. But this knowledge brought no peace, only a sharper, more focused agony. The formless ache of loss had been replaced by the very specific, burning hatred for a man he might never find. The revelation sent ripples through the other fractured families, reconfiguring their grief. For Maya's parents, the annual Lantern Vigil became an act of solemn remembrance for a life stolen, not just lost. Their daughter's art, a testament to a light extinguished by human darkness. In the shuttered home of Ben's parents, the news shattered their bitter fortress. The anger they had aimed at Liam, at the world, and at their own son finally collapsed, leaving them vulnerable and raw, with a pure, uncomplicated sorrow for the boy they had lost, absolved of blame, but not of tragedy. Detective Miller, for his part, put the file away not with the shame of failure, but with the weary resignation of an unfinished war. He had given David the truth. Justice, however, remained a ghost. In the end, David found himself back at the trailhead of the Oakhaven Caverns one last time, the rusted sign a silent testament to the story's violent turn. The mountain no longer felt like an adversary, but a vast, silent mausoleum that had been forced to hold a terrible secret. He had the echoes from the wall, the final, terrifying moments of his son's life preserved on tape and ink. He had a name for the monster in the dark. It wasn't closure, not the clean healing end he had once prayed for. It was something heavier, a permanent state of vigilance. The silence that had once represented the agony of the unknown now held a different weight. The chilling quiet of a killer still walking free. The search was over, but the waiting had just begun.